They laughed at his buried shelter, calling it foolish. But when the winter of '78 gripped the mountains, the prospectors soon realized the man they had mocked had built the only refuge strong enough to survive the storm. Now, as the first snow falls, they'll learn that the wilderness doesn't care about pride, only survival. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if tales of frontier ingenuity and survival move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will show you how one man's invention changed everything for those who dared face the wilderness. The wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the biting chill of an early winter. The prospectors huddled around a campfire, their laughter piercing the cold night air. The fire was a comfort, but the freezing winds were a reminder that the wilderness was always ready to claim what was its own. In the distance, a solitary figure moved steadily through the snow, his fur-lined coat brushing against the powdery drifts. His name was Elias Callahan, and though he had lived the harsh life of a prospector for over a decade, he was known as something of an outcast. The others, gathered around their fire, watched him as he trudged back toward his makeshift shelter. Elias had spent the last few days digging into the side of the mountain, preparing his home for the coming freeze. The others, setting up their own rough cabins, had scoffed at him for the odd choice of shelter, burying himself beneath the snow instead of building a traditional log cabin. It seemed a strange decision in a place where timber was abundant, and the thought of living buried in the earth felt absurd. But Elias didn't mind their mockery. To him, survival was a matter of precision, of doing what was necessary. The cabin he had built, more of a buried refuge than a proper house, was carefully constructed with thick logs and a layer of snow packed over the top for insulation. From the outside, it looked like just another pile of snow and wood, but inside, it was his fortress. A place he could escape the freezing temperatures and dangerous wildlife that lurked just outside the camp. As Elias worked through the final adjustments of his shelter, tightening the entrance to keep out the cold, the other prospectors exchanged looks of amusement. "He's buried himself like a rat," one of them said, a sharp laugh following. But Elias didn't hear them. He was too focused on the task at hand. The wilderness had a way of humbling those who underestimated it, and Elias knew this too well. He'd learned it the hard way during his earlier days prospecting alone in the Rockies. As the last log settled into place, Elias stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow. He tested the door, making sure it sealed tight. Satisfied, he headed for the fire, but not to join the others. He had no interest in their taunts. The winter of 1878 would prove his vision and his shelter right. But for now, the wilderness was still a quiet whisper, its stormy roar waiting just beyond the tree line. It didn't take long for the first storm to roll in. The foreboding clouds gathered like a dark curtain, blocking the sun and plunging the mountain into a thick twilight. By evening, the wind had picked up, rattling the tents and rattling the bones of the prospectors. The temperature dropped sharply, and the first snow began to fall in heavy, fat flakes. Elias, undeterred by the storm, settled into his buried refuge. He stoked a small fire inside the shelter, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. His shelter, with its carefully constructed air vents and snow insulation, was already holding up well against the storm. Outside, the wind howled and battered the landscape, but inside Elias's shelter, the air was still, warm, and secure. Meanwhile, the others were struggling. Their hastily built cabins, though sturdy, were no match for the ferocity of the storm. The timber creaked under the weight of snow, and the wind pushed through the cracks in their walls. Inside, the cold crept in relentlessly. Even with the fire stoked high, the chill in the air was inescapable. One of the prospectors, Henry Miller, had already tried to make his way over to Elias's shelter earlier that evening. His boots crunched loudly in the fresh snow as he plodded through the blizzard. A desperate thought at the back of his mind: Elias's shelter was buried. Yes, but he was certain it was warmer inside. He reached the mound of snow and logs where Elias had disappeared earlier that day. The storm was growing fiercer, and Henry, wind-burned and shivering, realized the severity of his mistake. He knocked against the door, hoping for a sign of life. A minute passed, and there was no response. In the distance, Elias's silhouette appeared, walking calmly toward Henry, with his fur-lined coat wrapped tight against the storm. His boots, thick and sturdy, cut through the snow as if the mountain was an old friend. "You're too late," Elias said, his voice steady despite the wind that whipped past them. "The storm's only just started." Henry didn't argue. He had no words. Instead, he followed Elias back to the shelter, the bitter cold biting at his skin with every step. Inside Elias's refuge, the warmth was immediate, a stark contrast to the world outside. Henry let out a long breath as he sat by the fire, the heat already starting to work through his numb limbs. Elias didn't ask questions. He simply went about his routine, as if they were the only two souls in a world of frozen silence. As the storm raged on outside, Elias knew the others would soon realize their mistake. Their cabins, though they appeared sturdy, would not withstand the full force of the winter. And when they finally came crawling to his door, Elias would be ready not for vengeance or pride, but for survival. The storm lasted for days, relentless and unforgiving. The snow piled high against the sides of the cabins, pushing them down into the frozen earth, and the wind never stopped its howling. Inside the buried shelter, Elias had no such worries. The fire kept him warm, the walls were thick, and the snow above insulated him like a thick blanket, blocking out the cold. But the other prospectors, trapped in their cramped cabins, were feeling the full force of the storm. The wind howled at their walls, and the temperature plummeted, colder than any winter they had faced before. Henry Miller, who had taken refuge in Elias's shelter, stared at the ceiling as the storm raged outside. He could hear the others in their cabins, their desperate attempts to keep the fires burning, their voices tinged with worry. Days passed, and the storm seemed to grow stronger, with no sign of stopping. Elias kept to his routine, hunting small game, tending to his fire, and reading through the few books he had brought with him, stories of survival, of men who had faced worse and come out stronger. He wasn't a man given to showing off, nor did he care about the mockery he had endured from the others. But now, as the storm wore on, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over him. The wilderness had a way of stripping away pride, revealing only what was necessary to survive. By the third day of the storm, Henry had started talking about the others. "They'll need help," he said quietly, his voice full of concern as he warmed his hands by the fire. Elias didn't respond at first, focused on his work, but Henry persisted. "They'll freeze in those cabins if this keeps up." Elias sighed, leaning back against the wall, the heat from the fire glowing softly on his face. "They made their choices," he said quietly. "They'll learn from it." The following day, Elias heard the sound of muffled footsteps outside, followed by a knock on the door. He stood, feeling the weight of the moment. He opened it cautiously, expecting it to be Henry again, but instead, a man he didn't recognize stood there. His face was red from the cold, his eyes wide with desperation. "Elias, please let us in," the man pleaded, his voice cracking. "We can't last much longer out there. Our cabins are falling apart." Elias didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, and the man stumbled in, immediately feeling the warmth of the shelter. Over the next few hours, more and more men arrived, stumbling through the snow with whatever strength they had left. They came in, cold and tired, their pride long gone. One by one, they gathered around the fire, each man silent, humbled by the reality of the storm. Elias never spoke a word of his previous warnings. He didn't have to. The storm had done its work, and now they were all equals in the face of nature's power. As the men settled in, Elias noticed Henry staring at him, a quiet understanding in his eyes. The prospectors had learned their lesson. Elias had built the only shelter that could withstand the storm, and now they had to rely on his ingenuity, whether they wanted to or not. The storm did not relent. It stretched into a second week, covering the mountains in a thick white blanket that made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. Elias's shelter, buried deep in the snow, was the only refuge. The fire never went out, and the food supply was still holding strong, but the constant pressure of the storm weighed heavily on the men who had come seeking shelter. They were exhausted, their faces hollow from lack of sleep and food, but Elias kept a steady routine, never complaining, never wavering. He had learned long ago that complaining didn't change the situation, only action could. The men, once full of bravado, were now humbled by the severity of the winter. They took turns maintaining the fire, helping prepare meals, and keeping the shelter stocked with firewood. Each man, at some point, would leave the warmth of the shelter to try their hand at hunting or gathering, but, with every failed attempt, Elias could see the shift. The once dismissive men, those who had laughed at him, were beginning to see the value of his quiet, steady strength. One evening, as Elias returned from his latest hunt with a rabbit slung over his shoulder, he noticed a change in the atmosphere. The men were no longer talking about the cabins they had built. They weren't joking about Elias's buried shelter or making light of his methods. There was a quiet respect in their eyes, a tacit acknowledgement that his way of living buried in the snow, hidden away from the storm, had been the only real solution. That night, as the wind howled and the storm continued to rage outside, Henry Miller approached Elias by the fire. His face was shadowed by the flickering light, but Elias could tell that something had shifted in him. "I was wrong," Henry said quietly, his voice low, almost apologetic. Elias didn't respond immediately. He simply stirred the fire, his gaze steady. "Henry," continued, his words heavier than any apology, "we thought you were crazy, thought your shelter was foolish, but now I see why you built it the way you did." Elias met his gaze, his expression unchanged. "I didn't build it for them," he said, his voice calm. "I built it for me, and for anyone who was smart enough to understand that it was built for survival." Henry nodded, his eyes reflecting a rare moment of vulnerability. "You were right all along," he murmured. The storm had stripped away everything, pride, arrogance, even hope, and had replaced it with a raw understanding of survival. Elias knew this was not the end of the lesson. The winter of '78 would be one the men would never forget, a season of survival that would change them forever. And for Elias, it had been the confirmation of a truth he had always known. In the face of nature's fury, only the strong foundation of preparation could keep a man alive. Days bled into each other, a never-ending blur of snow, wind, and the quiet murmur of men learning the true meaning of survival. The storm raged on, and Elias's shelter remained the only place of refuge. The others, once proud of their hastily built cabins, were now resigned to the fact that the wilderness had a way of humbling even the strongest among them. The men who had sought refuge in Elias's shelter had settled into a strange rhythm. They were quieter now, no longer filled with the bravado that had marked their early days in the mountains. Instead, they moved with purpose, tending to the fire, making sure the shelter's provisions were well stocked. Elias had no time for idle talk, but he had noticed the subtle shift in the men's attitudes. They were beginning to understand what he had always known, that the wilderness wasn't a place for pride, but for humility and respect. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Elias sat by the fire sharpening his hunting knife. The others were huddled together, sharing what little food they had left, their faces gaunt from the endless days of fighting the storm. Henry Miller, the man who had first sought shelter in Elias's cabin, approached him slowly. His eyes were tired, but there was something different about him now. The arrogance had faded, replaced by something more genuine. "You've got something here, Elias," Henry said quietly, his voice rough from days of constant wind. "I thought you were mad when you built this place, thought you'd buried yourself alive, but now," he paused, taking a breath, "now I see you knew what you were doing." Elias didn't respond right away. He knew better than to boast. The storm had done that for him. Instead, he kept his eyes on the knife, feeling the metal under his calloused fingers. "It's not about being right," Elias replied quietly, his voice a steady calm in the face of the storm's fury. "It's about surviving." Henry nodded, his face filled with understanding. "You've got that figured out." It was a moment of quiet acknowledgement, one that spoke volumes without needing to be said aloud. The price of survival was steep, but the lessons were priceless. Elias had known the storm was coming long before it hit, and while the others had laughed and dismissed his plans, they were the ones now paying the price for their hubris. But there was no joy in Elias's victory, no satisfaction in watching the others suffer. He had lived through too much of his own hardship to take pride in their misfortune. For him, survival was not a victory, it was a necessity, a way of life forged in the fires of experience. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone, he was here because the wilderness demanded it. As the fire crackled, Elias glanced at the others. They were beginning to talk more now, telling stories of past winters, of the times they had escaped death by sheer luck. But Elias didn't join in. He had learned the hard way that luck had no place in the mountains. It was preparation, patience, and the will to endure that kept a man alive. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Elias knew that there were more lessons to come. But for now, in the warmth of his shelter, surrounded by those who had once mocked him, he allowed himself a small measure of peace. The wilderness had been unforgiving, but it had also been the teacher, and the men who had come to him for help were learning, in their own way, that survival was not about being the toughest, it was about being the smartest. The days dragged on, each one a mirror of the last, long, cold, and filled with the ceaseless howl of the storm that had turned the world outside into a frozen wasteland. Inside the shelter, however, there was warmth. The fire burned steadily, and the men took turns ensuring it never went out, knowing that without it, survival would be impossible. But the storm was not the only thing that tested their endurance. The strain of living so close, together, confined to the small space of Elias's shelter, began to show. The prospectors were used to solitude, to the freedom of the open wilderness. Now, trapped together with no escape, the tension between them was palpable. The once boisterous voices had quieted, replaced by an uneasy silence. Elias could feel the pressure mounting, but he didn't let it bother him. He had built this shelter to withstand the physical forces of nature, but he had also built it to withstand the mental strain that came with isolation. He had lived through worse on his own. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the storm to pass. One evening, as the wind began to pick up again, Elias stepped outside for a moment, needing the air. The cold hit him like a slap to the face, but it was a relief, a break from the stuffy warmth of the shelter. He stood for a moment, looking out at the howling storm, the snow swirling in endless patterns, as if the mountains themselves were alive. Then, he heard a voice behind him. "You shouldn't be out here, Elias," Henry said from the doorway. He had been watching Elias from inside, his face pale from the flickering firelight. "I need the cold," Elias answered simply, not turning to face him. "The storm doesn't stop, it just keeps pushing forward." Henry didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped up beside Elias, staring out into the storm. For a moment there was silence between them, the only sound the howling wind and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" Henry asked suddenly. "All this, living out here, fighting the elements, running from the world." Elias didn't look at him, but the question lingered in the air between them. "I don't run from the world," Elias said after a moment. "I just don't need it. Not out here. Out here, it's just me and the storm." Henry stood quietly beside him, digesting his words. Then, he gave a small nod. "Maybe you're right." Elias allowed himself a brief glance at Henry. The man had changed. There was no longer any trace of the arrogant mockery in his eyes. Instead, there was something more genuine, more reflective. "We'll make it through," Elias said, his voice steady. "Just keep moving forward." The storm raged on, but Elias knew that in the heart of the wilderness, survival wasn't just about finding shelter from the storm. It was about enduring, about pushing forward even when the world seemed to be closing in, and as long as he had the will to survive, nothing else mattered. The storm, like all storms, would eventually pass. And when it did, the men in Elias's shelter would be ready to face whatever came next. But for now, they had only one task: endure the storm and let it teach them what they needed to know. The storm had now been relentless for over 3 weeks, and the men in Elias's shelter were beginning to show the strain of isolation and deprivation. Food was running low. The wild game had become scarce, and the cold had driven the small animals deeper into the woods, leaving the men with only dried meat and stale bread to sustain them. Each day felt like a battle against the elements, and as the days turned into weeks, the tension inside the shelter grew thicker. Henry Miller, once a man who mocked Elias for his strange shelter, had become the first to crack. The constant confinement, the ever-present cold, and the endless waiting were beginning to break down his resolve. His usual quiet demeanor had shifted to frustration, and every sound from the storm outside seemed to trigger a new wave of irritation. It wasn't just Henry. The other men, too, were beginning to show signs of desperation. There were whispered arguments over who would take the next turn to gather firewood, and a few men had begun to question Elias's decision to leave the shelter for long periods to hunt. They were afraid to go out into the storm themselves, yet the growing hunger gnawed at their spirits. One evening, as the fire crackled and the shadows stretched long across the shelter, Elias sat quietly in the corner, cleaning his rifle. The other men were gathered around the fire, silent, lost in their own thoughts. It was then that Henry finally broke the silence. "I can't take it anymore, Elias," Henry said, his voice strained, his eyes wild. He stood up from his spot by the fire, pacing in agitation. "This isn't living. We're trapped. You might have planned for this storm, but we didn't sign up for this kind of life. I want out. I want to be free." The room seemed to freeze at his words. The fire's crackling was the only sound as the men exchanged uneasy glances. Elias remained silent, his hands still moving methodically over his rifle. He understood Henry's frustration. He had felt it himself in the past, the suffocating weight of the wilderness, the feeling of being trapped, and the desire to escape. But Elias knew there was no escape. Not from the storm, not from the wilderness. The only way out was through. "Henry," Elias said, his voice calm but firm, "we're all in this together. You don't get to just walk away." Henry stopped pacing, glaring at Elias with a mixture of anger and helplessness. "You think I don't know that," he spat. "But I can't sit here and pretend this is normal. I'm not made for this. I'm not like you." Elias didn't flinch. He had heard this before from men who couldn't handle the strain, men who thought that nature would bend to their will if they only fought hard enough. The wilderness didn't care about pride or stubbornness. It was a test of survival, and not everyone made it through. "You'll make it through if you stop fighting it," Elias said, his voice steady. "The storm won't last forever. And when it's over, you'll see. It's about holding on, no matter how hard it gets." Henry was silent for a long moment, and the weight of his frustration hung heavy in the air. Finally he sat back down by the fire, his eyes downcast. The other men didn't speak. They knew there was nothing left to say. The storm outside had become a constant roar, like an animal pacing in the wild. But inside the shelter, the silence settled once again, broken only by the crackling fire. The breaking point had come, but they had not broken. Not yet. The storm continued to rage outside, but the men in Elias's shelter had begun to settle into a new rhythm. The initial panic and frustration had passed, replaced by a grudging acceptance. They were still trapped, still stuck in the belly of the beast that was winter, but they were no longer fighting it. At least not all of them. Elias had been right about one thing. The storm would eventually pass. It didn't matter how long it took. The wilderness had its way of forcing a man to accept what he could not control. And slowly, the men had begun to do just that. Henry had finally stopped fighting. He had thrown himself into the daily routines of the shelter, chopping wood and helping prepare meals. The fire was still the lifeblood of the shelter, and he had come to appreciate how much Elias had thought about every detail. The structure was solid, the insulation strong, and the fire was always burning. They were surviving. Not thriving, but surviving. One morning, after a night of relentless snow and wind, Elias stood by the door of the shelter and glanced out into the swirling white chaos. The storm had slowed a bit. It was still fierce, but the intensity had diminished. There was a shift in the air, a change in the way the wind blew. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but Elias felt it deep in his bones. He turned to the others. "We might have a break in the storm soon. If we can hold out for just a bit longer, we'll be able to hunt again. There's still game out there. It's just hiding." The men nodded quietly. They had learned to trust Elias by now to follow his lead. He had shown them that survival wasn't about force, it was about patience, about waiting for the right moment. The next morning, Elias stepped out into the cold, his breath misting in the air. The snow was still falling, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating storm they had grown used to. It was lighter, quieter, as if the world itself was waiting. Elias set out into the snow, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement. There was no doubt in his mind that they could make it through this, that they could find a way to push forward. He had seen storms like this before. They were long, brutal, and unyielding, but they always passed. By midday, Elias returned to the shelter with a rabbit in hand, the first game he had been able to catch in days. The men inside greeted him with quiet relief, their eyes flicking to the fresh meat in his hands. Elias placed the rabbit on the small fire, beginning to prepare it for the evening meal. As he worked, the men gathered around, their eyes brighter now, their shoulders less burdened. The storm was not over, but the first light of hope had broken through the storm's darkness. That evening, as they ate the fresh meat, there was a quiet joy in the air. They had weathered the worst of the storm, and they had done it together. The wilderness was still unforgiving, but they had found a way to endure. And for the first time since the storm had begun, Elias allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The wilderness had not broken them, and when the storm finally passed, they would be ready. The morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt unnatural after weeks of relentless wind and snow. The air was heavy with anticipation, and as Elias stepped outside, the familiar roar of the storm was gone. The winds had died down, leaving only the gentle whisper of snowflakes drifting from the sky. The sun, pale and distant, peeked through the heavy clouds, casting a weak light over the snow-covered landscape. Elias stood still for a moment, allowing himself to savor the rare peace that came after a storm. The world around him was still, untouched by the chaos that had come before. The storm had passed, and the mountains were now silent, offering a strange kind of calm. But Elias knew better than to relax too quickly. The wilderness had a way of turning back on you when you least expected it. He turned back toward the shelter, knowing the men inside would be eager for the respite. As he entered, he saw the familiar faces, tired, worn, but relieved. They had made it through the storm, and now it was time to move forward. "It's over," Elias said simply, a small smile tugging at his lips. The men nodded, though their exhaustion was still apparent. The next few days were spent in a flurry of activity. The men ventured out into the world they had been cut off from for so long, cutting firewood, hunting, and repairing the damage to their cabins. The landscape outside had changed, the deep snow leaving tracks of wildlife and signs of the storm's fury. Elias watched from the shelter, content to let the others take the lead. The storm had shown them what they were capable of, and now it was their turn to rebuild. The mountain would continue to test them, but they had survived. Together, weeks passed, and the landscape began to thaw, revealing the damage left behind by the storm. The men had rebuilt their cabins, and the air was filled with the sounds of life returning to normal. Hunting trips had become more successful, and the food supply was once again stable. The prospectors who had once mocked Elias were now full of quiet respect. They had learned that survival in the wilderness wasn't about force or pride, it was about preparation, patience, and an unwavering will to endure. The lessons of the storm had imprinted on them, shaping their approach to life in the mountains. Elias, however, remained distant from the group, content to live his life in solitude, as he always had. He had shared his shelter and his wisdom, but he was no teacher. He had done what he needed to do to survive, and now the others would carry those lessons with them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias stood at the edge of the shelter, watching the fading light reflect off the snow. The storm had passed, but the wilderness had left its mark. Not just on the land, but on the men who had weathered it. They were stronger now, and so was he. As Elias turned to retreat into his cabin for the night, a small, contented smile tugged at his lips. The mountains had a way of testing a man's spirit, but in the end, it was not the storm that defined them. It was their ability to survive it.